We're sitting in the offices of the library at Fashion Institute of Technology on the afternoon of March 14th, 1979. This is John Toohey speaking, and with me is Miss Nancy White, a certainly historically important person for her role as a editor of Harper's Bazaar and her just lifelong involvement in the fashion industry. And we certainly are thankful for Ms. White's continued involvement at FIT, and especially, of course, for her involvement in this project on the life of Vera Maxwell. Welcome, Ms. White.
It's good to see you again.
Yeah. I know that you're here working in the library. You seem to never stop from one project to the next. What is this project you're working on now?
John, this is a book on a very important photographer called Martin Munkaczy. He's a Hungarian. He was a photojournalist originally, and then when he came to the States and Carmel Snow took him under her wing, she asked him to photograph fashion, and he indeed was the first photographer to make fashion move. Dick Avedon, in a piece he did for the Bazaar after Munkaczy's death, credits Munkaczy with the inspiration for his work of becoming a photographer. Cartier-Bresson as well. He died tragically, not tragically, he died very suddenly, happily watching, I think, a soccer match. He loved athletics and sports, but he died penniless and was about to sink without a trace when Hofstra, in the process of doing a show on fashion photographers, asked me to help them, and when I went out there, I found that they knew very little about Munkaczy. I was fortunate enough to know him and to work with him, so I became, the person that was answering questions on Munkaczy. And John Aston, who was at that time a fashion director at Harper's Bazaar for the promotion department, not the editorial department, became interested and asked me if I'd work on a book on Munkaczy. It's been fascinating but difficult work because so little of it was left, because in his latter years, just before he died, when he was so broke, he lost everything and didn't keep track, and it's been a search project. So what I was doing this afternoon was making photocopies of the bound volumes of Harper's Bazaar in which his work appeared, in order to reproduce them in this book that John and I are working on. It's a book that we hope will be out for Christmas next year. I suppose it'll be about a 180-page, 200-page book, chiefly photographs, and we will reprint. I hope. I haven't talked to him, but I'm sure that he'll say yes. Dick's piece on Munkaczy. There'll be a scholarly piece by Bill Ewing from the Center for International Photography, a little thing from Cartier-Bresson, and that's about it as far as text is concerned. I've written something that's very brief and rather like Munkaczy's work, fast. He was a riveting guy, did a great deal of work in Hollywood. They adored him out there because for the first time, instead of those sort of stiff studio shots, he took pictures of people moving. I mean, they're just wonderful pictures. There's a picture of Elizabeth Arden standing on her hedge, which is a classic. And then there are marvelous pictures of Crawford and of Dietrich, and there's an old picture of Garbo under a big beach umbrella, so all you see are legs, but that's kind of fascinating. He had terrific history. He started off in Budapest and then moved to Berlin, but he was the highest paid photographer in Europe at the time, and he was one of the highest paid ones here. And it's just, there he was, sinking without a trace, and it's a labor of love, but it's a labor I love. Sort of getting things down on paper and going over his work. I mean, it's so contemporary. Everybody uses that word, but when you realize that these pictures were taken in the 30s and early 30s, they stand up superbly. And he was always, I worked with him the time I was a kid, and he never, he would never let the girl stop to comb her hair or brush her hair or look in the mirror. Just, he made the first famous picture was in the bazaar of Lucille Brokaw running on a beach on a cold January day, and he just made her run, whereas, normally bathing suits would be photographed in a studio or in a, static situation.
Posed,
Well, he
yeah.
stopped all the static, and as you go through the volumes, it's incredible the influence he's had on many, many photographers. I'm not going to name names. I just mentioned Dick and Cartier-Bresson because they have written on the subject, but his influence was so strong, still is. I just ran into a picture of a girl on roller skates. It looks as if she could have been photographed today.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really what it's all about. This is the tedious part in a way, but thank heaven for FIT and your bound volumes, because we couldn't have, we really, there would have been no way to produce the book without your files and your volumes.
Well, that's great, and of course, and that's the purpose of the library, not only to serve the students, but also the industry and people such as yourself, serious researchers and editors and publishers. Miss White, you have had, in fact, I certainly not to embarrass you, but I must tell you that the respect that is held for you at FIT is really wonderful. I mean, from my vantage point, and the few times I've had the pleasure of working with you or being with you, there's no question why it's there. You've had a very, very involved, very full career in the fashion industry from an unusual vantage point, that of the critic, so to speak, the observer, at times the promoter, at times when I'm sure you felt it was necessary, your magazine could step out and say to a designer, stop. You're doing the wrong thing, you're going the wrong way. In other words, your influence was critical, but obviously very positive, in that you, regardless of what you said, you were helping. Whether it was negative or positive, there was help behind the statements that you made. And to a library collection, of course, that kind of person is a hero. I'd like you, if you wouldn't mind, to look back to those earlier years when you met so many of the designers who were fighting their way through the Depression, trying to make a go of it in the 30s. And you worked with Dorothy Shaver and her whole publicity effort to promote American design. And of course, Harper's has always been a supporter of American fashion. There is one person in particular I'd like you to think back about, if you would, and that is Vera Maxwell, the American designer. And could you sort of draw a picture for us of what she was like when you first met her, or what the circumstances were all about?
John, when I first met Vera, I know that I was on Good Housekeeping.
I'm sorry.
And, well, that's quite, that's when I knew many of the designers. And I remember Vera, even in those days, I'm not sure whether she was in business for herself at that time. I don't think so. But Vera was one of that group, the second wave of Dorothy Shaver's American designers. Claire Potter and Vera and Claire McCardle and a couple of others. But the thing that I remember most about Vera in the beginning, when I first knew her, she was so friendly and she was so interested. And I was young, and her clothes were a little rich for Good Housekeeping's blood. I could not use them in the magazine frequently, but I tried to, as best I could, to report on American design and the American designers in support of what Dorothy Shaver was doing. And I we did very well with children's clothes at Good Housekeeping. And so I asked Vera one day if she would do some children's things, and she was thrilled at the idea and just rolled up her sleeves immediately and made some absolutely enchanting children's coats. She was in the coat world then. She was not making dresses, and I remember a gray flannel coat that she made and that we photographed that was just, marvelous looking, and it was just the shot in the arm that the children's market needed at the moment. But it's so typical of Vera. She's such an open-minded person. She's interested in so many things. I don't know how well you know her, but when you realize that Vera was originally a dancer, is still interested in the dance and in opera. She's interested in cooking. She's interested in croquet. She's interested in her grandchildren. She has the most incredible mixture of friends. For instance, I heard just yesterday that she'd met Reggie Jackson and he took her to Studio 54. Now, Vera's candid about her age and says she's 75, and we've celebrated her birthday. But that's so typical. There she'll be at her desk designing in the morning. Then she'd fly home and have a luncheon with Brendan Gill and, it could be a Princess Grace, it could be Kathy Tankus, it could be Jim McMullen, who runs the restaurant. She's absolutely incredible, and she's a catalyst, a marvelous catalyst, the way she brings so many different people together. When you lunch there, there's always a writer. There's, Mrs. Avery Fisher, for instance, Netta Logan. The conversation just flows like magic, and it's all because of Vera. She's really a Renaissance woman, and in the true sense that she's beautifully read and wonderfully traveled. And she just makes friends wherever she goes, and she doesn't let the ball drop. If she meets somebody, she continues that. I mean, if she meets somebody that interests her, and practically everyone does, she doesn't let it drop there. She continues the relationship and continues the friendship. I talked to Kathy Tankus yesterday, whom you may or may not know. She's very beautiful and very chic and travels the world over. And she said of Vera's clothes something that I'd like to repeat to you. She said Vera's a designer who understands women and understands their needs. There's a timelessness about her clothes, as we know, and thank heaven there is. I think that's one of her great and wonderful qualities, the fact that you can, if you still had a Vera Maxwell from the early 1930s, you could still wear it today. You just have to put a zipper in instead of hooks and eyes. And the way she's traveled the world over to get her fabrics to the top of a mountain in Africa, someplace like that, to get a jalaba cloth that came in just piece by piece. The going to the crofters and the mills and working with all of the woolen people, the small people in Scotland and in Ireland and in England too. But she never stops. I mean, she's constantly full of ideas and full of an enthusiasm. I think that's one of the great qualities of Vera, along with all the other things I've mentioned. She has a undying curiosity about people, about things, about the theater. She's an avid theater goer. But if you talk to her, if you say you've been to a new little restaurant, she'll be there the next day, because she never will let any grass grow under her feet. And I'm sure that, she was a skier. She was an awfully good skier. According to a friend of mine he was a very good skier. He was absolutely, he would rather go skiing with Vera than with anyone else. And he was a very attractive gentleman with a vast number of ladies in the wings, but it was Vera that really intrigued him the most. Loved to dance with her. She's a marvelous dancer. My husband happens to be a good dancer, and he loves to dance with Vera. They Viennese waltz up a storm and have a marvelous time. She's interested she's so generous to the lighthouse. She's generous as far as Channel 13 when I was working for Channel 13 on the auction. Every time you call Vera, you strike life. If you get a turn down, which is rare, it's always with a beautiful explanation. But it's just marvelous to talk to her on the telephone about anything. She has a marvelous thing where she puts a cabbage in the middle of the table as a centerpiece, and I can't make mine work the way hers work, but she has offered to come up and, work with the cabbage, so I'll have a centerpiece too. These are all just details, but I think they're things that make her the person she is. I find about her clothes, in thinking a minute ago, she makes clothes work for you rather than you're having to work for your clothes, which in this day and age I think is terribly important. None of us have the time or the self-indulgence to go through the business of going to work for your clothes. Your clothes have to work for you, and she thinks of you the entire time. She thinks of the customer. Happened to be in the showroom last week, and over again she said, but think of the woman out there who is not 5'8" or 5'7.5" as her models are, and think of where she wants her pockets. And if she's going to buy a cape, she has to have the pockets to anchor the cape down. The pockets can't be too low because her customer, or the average customer, doesn't have long arms. Those are models, not customers. And she does understand. She loves going out, although I'm sure it's terribly tiring to her customers and to the shops that carry her clothes, talking with them, making sure that, learning. That's the other thing about Vera, she's still learning. There's darn little that she has to learn, but I think every time she talks with the customer, she probably learns something and brings it back to her work. I think we're very fortunate to have had her for these many years. As you know, she is celebrating her 30th year in business for herself and her 50th year in the fashion industry, and her contributions have been numerous, and she's always stuck to her last. She's never, gone off on tangents, ever. She believes in classics, she believes in quality, and she believes in simplicity, and she believes in function. Now.
Wow, that certainly is a statement. Miss White, when Madame Gray was in New York last fall, we had the privilege of interviewing her as well. And she was asked, one of the questions asked of her was, do you think there is such a thing as American fashion, as an American fashion, as an American style? And her answer was that, first of all, she avoided the question. She did not want to answer the question. But then she said that since we had asked it, she would indeed answer it. And her answer was that she does not think there is such a thing as American fashion. She thinks that there is only French fashion, that Americans receive their inspiration from Paris. However, she was quick to add that what Americans do with that information is much more successful and a much better product than what the French do with it. What is your opinion on that statement? Do you define American fashion as an entity, or do you see it as a result of other influences?
Oh no, I see it as an entity. I'm terribly proud of American fashion. I admire Madame Gray extraordinarily. I would question only one thing. I remember some years ago when I was working for Bergdorf Goodman, I asked Madame Gray to come to the store and go through it with me. And she'd not seen anything like that before. And I think she perhaps has not had that much exposure to American fashion. I admire her opinion. I certainly admire her designing. She's, after all, I guess the last great French dressmaker. She is such a law unto herself, and she designs so specifically in her own sort of world, with her little pincushion at her waist and the turban on her head and her fingers flying over the model as she does her fittings, and she drapes on the figure, as you know, and not on a form. That's my only comment on her statement. I'm not, for an instant, arguing with what is her opinion, because I think she has every right and I can understand it, but I would really love to have her exposed perhaps more to American fashion. She doesn't come here very frequently, and when she does, she's so busy and she's so rushed, and she doesn't have that much time for exploring. But she was very interested in what I showed her at Bergdorf. She was interested in the prices too. And the prices at Bergdorf, well, in those days they weren't quite as high as they are today, but like all prices. But it seems to me that that was what intrigued her more. She'd look, you know, and then she'd understand immediately what she was seeing from a fashion and a manufacturing or a workmanship standpoint. But then when I'd tell her what the price, that really riveted her.
So then, I guess I could have guessed the answer to that question. And in then the American fashion scene, in the history of American fashion, where would you place Vera Maxwell?
I place Vera as, with all the things I've said of her before, I think she's part of the backbone of American fashion. All right.
Good. Miss White, thank you very much for your time, and we certainly enjoyed these few moments with you.
Well, I enjoyed talking to you, and thank you again for your help on the book we're working on.
Great.